It reflects and holds the light and draws us toward it. The gold of ancient Panama. Unknown artisans shaped it into works of exquisite detail, projecting power from this world to the next. With a brilliance that has outlasted centuries, it looks out to us, surrounded by mystery. Panama City, a dynamic and diverse metropolis of nearly 2 million people, a few miles from the Panama Canal and the Pacific Ocean. It's a major center of banking and trade for Central and South America. 500 years ago, it was a stopover point for most of the gold that Spain plundered from the Americas. It is literally a city that gold built. But the story of gold in Panama begins many centuries earlier. Panama is part of a tropical land bridge that connects the North and South American continents.
The Isthmus of Panama has some of the oldest remains in the Americas that go back at least to 12,000 years ago and indicate that Panama was initially settled by people who had traveled through Central America during the end of the Ice Age.
They explored a landscape of plains, rivers, and mountains.
They were part of a population that migrated from North America on their way down to South America, and that the Central American Isthmus was occupied as early as areas of the southeastern United States and western South America.
Their domain encompassed the lands of present-day Colombia, Panama, and Costa Rica. Because they left no written language, we don't know what they called themselves. Scholars used the name of where they lived, in the central region of present-day Panama, the Grand Cocle.
People will often make that mistake of thinking that they were Mayans or Aztecs. I think it's very important to recognize that the populations of Panama were important in their own right and were very different from the populations that people are more familiar with in Mexico and Peru. They had different language, different customs, different history, but they were smaller populations.
They didn't build large cities of stone, but lived in clusters of small villages.
They used primarily perishable materials, which we might identify today as a green strategy. But because they built using wood and thatch and cane and other perishable materials, we don't have the enormous pyramids. We don't have the standing architecture that we have for many sites in the Maya area. And that's something that, ironically, because they used perishable organic materials, they seem to us sometimes to be less developed or less civilized than the Mayas. We now recognize that green can actually be more civilized.
They settled along rivers that provided fresh water, food, and routes for travel and trade with other people in the region. The Cocle brought back both raw materials and new ideas.
They could travel between the coast and the interior. They could travel up and down the coast. They probably had connections that went as far away as Colombia or Ecuador or even perhaps up to Mexico.
The people of Grand Cocle thrived in a lush, tropical environment. They were surrounded by an immense variety of birds and animals, and they felt a deep connection to the natural world. They lived close to the equator, where the sun dominates the sky for most of the day and seems particularly brilliant. In gold, the Cocle found a powerful reflection of the sun's infinite energy, which brought life and illumination to the world. Its majestic presence in the sky each day and its unfailing return each dawn was a symbol of immortality.
It doesn't stain, and it doesn't oxidize, it doesn't darken, it's always bright. For that reason, it's chosen as a metaphor for human power and human ability.
The Grand Cocle artisans also learned to utilize copper, which they found in rocky outcrops in the mountains of Panama. They related the qualities of this metal with another powerful celestial presence, the moon. The Cocle saw the cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth enacted in the waxing and waning of the moon every 28 days.
The combination of gold and copper itself was considered to be a magical combination, the gold being a yellower color that was associated with the sun, and the copper having a reddish color that was sometimes associated with blood.
Combining gold and copper into a new material called tumbaga represented a union of the sun and the moon and a reenactment of the creative force that kept the Cocle cosmos in balance. In the Cocle worldview, the boundaries between humans and animals weren't clear-cut or fixed. The Cocle believed that certain animals had special powers that humans could draw on. The person who wore this pendant could access that power, inspire respect from his peers, and frighten enemies.
The powers of the crocodilians was that they could move between different worlds. They lived in the water, but they came up on land. And this is something that would have been observed and would have been considered something very important. And they also were very good at very rapid ambushes, which is how they capture their prey. So these qualities are ones that would have been attractive, especially in the context of warfare and power.
In contrast to such powerful creatures as the crocodile, the Cocle also created many representations of the frog.
The frog is one of the quintessential shapeshifters. It goes from a frog egg to a tadpole to a creature that's sort of a mix between a tadpole and a frog to a fully mature frog. And this would have fascinated the people who observed this transformation. And the concept of shape-shifting, especially the way that people might transform themselves into animals or vice versa, probably became a very important part of the mythology.
The creations of the Cocle gold workers were worn by the elites of the society as an unmistakable sign of status and power.
One of the most important qualities of gold is the sort of ooh shiny effect. It's a brighter and flashier material than any of the other materials that they were using. And for that reason would have seemed almost magical in the way that it played with light. The use of large amounts of gold to cover the body may have been associated with the observation that gold doesn't corrode, that gold is something that lasts, that gold is something that can sit in the ground for thousands of years and look exactly the same. Often when people look at these gold pectorals, they think that they must have had sort of a protective function, almost like armor. But gold is very, very soft, and these objects are made out of almost pure gold, and therefore really are very flexible and very easy to bend and would not have given very much protection at all. They were worn for the flash. These objects are likely to have been worn in the context of intergroup conflict or warfare because they would have helped to identify the leaders. The flashiness of it is something that would have been immediately apparent in a group of people, and the ones who were wearing the most bling would have been easily identified as the important people.
Even in death, gold played a powerful role. The most important members of the community were buried wearing the gold they had worn in life.
Many of the gold objects that we know are ones that were recovered from burials where they were placed with the bodies, with the corpses, as a way of dressing them, perhaps for the afterlife, or perhaps as a way of simply placing these objects with the body in order to take them out of use. And this is an interesting concept. We don't really know which of these it was, whether they were placing these objects in the burial in order to send the person away wearing them, or whether it had the very practical function of taking objects out of circulation so that they could not be worn by anyone else.
Because the Cocle felt these gold adornments possessed spiritual or magical powers, it was important to bury these objects with the person who owned them.
The more powerful a person was, the more gold was buried with them, but the objects themselves were considered to have stories, perhaps spirits, perhaps power, and therefore would have been inappropriate to have around if the person to whom they belonged was no longer with us. And so it may have been appropriate to bury gold objects as it was to bury the person. because those objects would have been dangerous in the hands of someone else.
For centuries, the Cocle used abundant local materials and trade goods to shape objects from stone, jade, and clay. Working with these materials, the Cocle artisans developed images that were beautifully alive. They used bold designs on a polished surface. About 2,000 years ago, the art of metallurgy and gold working spread from Colombia to Panama.
The most likely source for the gold would have come from rivers and from washing deposits in fashion very similar to what panning for gold in California looked like, probably using ceramic vessels to wash the sediments that were coming out of the riverbanks.
Over time, the Cocle became masters of exploring the possibilities of this new technology.
If you think about the other materials that they were working, such as stone or shell, it's clear that gold was much more versatile in terms of what it could be made into. You could hammer it flat, you could cast it in the form of an animal, you could shape it in a lot of different ways. We don't know for sure who it was that worked with gold, but we do have Spanish accounts that indicate that it was the chiefs or caciques who often were skilled gold workers and made their own objects. I suspect, and it seems very likely, that if it was shamans or magic workers who were using these objects, that they probably also knew how to make them and were participating in manufacturing the objects that they used.
The Cocle gold workers used innovation, teamwork, and expertise. They first had to solve the problem of heating gold to its melting point, over 1,000 degrees. In a group effort, they made the fire burn hotter by blowing through long tubes. They learned that when gold is combined with copper, its melting point is lower than either gold or copper. Much of what appears to be pure gold in these objects is actually a gold-copper alloy called tumbaga.
One of the tricks of gold working with this gold-copper alloy was that you could use an acid bath to remove some of the copper from the surface of the object and then polish it so that the surface looked like pure gold, even though the piece itself was made of an alloy.
For three-dimensional objects, the Cocle used a method called lost wax casting. This demonstration will show casting a nose ring that is similar to the ones that the Cocle made. David Goodman, an expert gold worker and jewelry designer, will use a combination of ancient methods and modern tools. He begins by shaping a wax model. Then he attaches small tubes called sprues. Later in the casting process, these sprues will allow molten metal to be poured into a mold and for wax and gases to escape during the casting process. The model is then placed into a cylinder so that plaster can be poured around it to form a mold. When the plaster is hardened, David puts the mold into a kiln. The high temperature of the kiln will melt and burn away the wax. This leaves a cavity inside the mold that is an exact copy of the original model. David will use silver to demonstrate the next step of lost wax casting. He pours molten metal into the mold using the sprues that he had attached earlier. While the mold is still hot, he immerses it in cold water. The mold is broken by the shock of the cold water and reveals the cast silver nose ring inside.
Oh, look, it worked.
David removes the sprues and polishes out rough areas on the cast silver. To make this nose ring, David Goodman has used a technique that is very similar to the process used by the Cocle more than 1,000 years ago.
There's a wonderful quote that comes from Albrecht Dürer, who is a famous engraver and artist in the Netherlands, who described seeing some of the gold objects that were coming back from the Americas and just marveled at the workmanship that went into making them and said that he felt that some of the best goldsmiths in Europe couldn't reproduce them.
The beginning of the 16th century brought an age of exploration and exploitation. In 1502, Christopher Columbus encountered the Caribbean coast of Panama on his fourth and last voyage. Native people greeted him wearing gold. Inspired with the promise of great wealth, he named the region Costa Rica, the Rich Coast.
Scholarship now makes it absolutely clear that Christopher Columbus was looking for gold. That was the main thing that motivated him. And of course they found it. Columbus not in the quantities that he ever expected, but the Spanish who followed him certainly did in Mexico and in Peru. This all began with the discovery of gold in Panama.
Soon, Spanish conquistadors followed with an unquenchable thirst for gold and wealth. In their eyes, gold in Panama had no cultural or spiritual value. In their original state, the extraordinary gold objects of the Grande Coquelin culture were virtually useless to the Europeans. The Spanish were only interested in the kind of riches they could transport easily back to Spain. An untold amount of sophisticated native artistry was lost forever when it was melted down into identical gold bars for the voyage to Spain.
They were destroyed almost immediately for their bullion value, but also, I think, because the Spanish were afraid of what they represented. Keep in mind, we're talking about the 16th century and the early 17th century when there was tremendous fear of witchcraft and evil magic. There was a fear that these objects had magical power and that by destroying them and melting them down in the fire, you were not only producing bullion, but you were also cleaning these objects of whatever magical residue of sorcery that the Spanish felt they still had.
But many gold objects remained hidden in the burial mounds of central Panama and survived the Spanish conquest. They may never have been discovered if a river hadn't changed its course about 80 years ago in a place called Sitio Conte.
Sitio Conte was discovered as the result of finds of gold objects that were literally spilling out of the riverbank. The river that runs by Sitio Conte would flood and would wash into areas that had ancient burials, and objects from these were discovered by workmen on the Conte property, who then recognized the quantity and the value of these objects, but also the importance of these objects for understanding the archaeology of the area.
To protect the site from looting, the owners of the property, the Conte family, searched for a trained archaeologist to excavate the site.
And so when these finds appeared on the Conte property, Samuel Lothrop was contacted through contacts at Harvard University, and it became clear that they had a major excavation to undertake.
Lothrop was already an expert in the ceramics of the region, and his work at Sitio Conte greatly expanded what we know about the culture of the Coquelin. He published 2 scholarly volumes of his findings, which contain very detailed drawings and photographs of what was uncovered.
I find Lothrop's publications to be among the best that were ever produced in American archaeology. They're a joy to look through in terms of the quality of the pictures and the illustrations and the descriptions.
The University of Pennsylvania made a second expedition to Sitio Conte and discovered that several of the remains were covered with gold, indicating these people were probably among the leadership and elite.
The gold found at Sitio Conte came just a decade or so after the discovery of King Tut's tomb, and the comparison is apt. It was some very well-preserved burials with enormous quantities of gold objects in them. With the invasion of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, priorities shifted very dramatically, and unfortunately excavations at Sitio Conte during the Second World War simply were not practical.
At the same time, Oklahoma oil man and collector Thomas Gilcrease was building an extraordinary collection of pre-Columbian objects from North and South America. He recognized the importance of these new discoveries in Panama, and he purchased a substantial group of Coquelin gold objects and ceramics in the 1940s. The Gilcrease Museum collection is very similar in style and type to the objects found at Sitio Conte and nearby.
It's always a challenge to know how to interpret something, but a very good archaeological practice is to go from the known to the unknown. What we need to do is we always think in terms of a hypothesis that we can test. It's one thing to speculate about what something was. It's another issue altogether to try to find some convincing evidence in support of it. We can now use high-tech analysis to determine the composition of gold objects in a fashion that wasn't available to us before. And this is becoming very important in terms of recognizing workshops, recognizing sources, and also identifying metallurgical traditions that are specific to a particular place.
Gilcrease Museum staff are using a breakthrough in portable X-ray technology to learn more about the makeup of the objects from Panama. This analysis does not degrade the object and provides a precise readout of its composition in about 30 seconds. The question being investigated is whether Cochlear gold workers use different amounts of gold and other metals for a lost wax casting than for an object made from a paper-thin gold sheet.
So this object is composed elementally of 70% gold, almost 18% copper, and 5% silver. So this result, with 81% gold, over 17% silver, but no copper, allowed them to hammer the gold sheet very thin without it breaking.
There is so much to be learned about these objects and the people who made them. There are many questions about the Cochlear we may never answer.
One of the remarkable things about gold is its universal value. There's really not a culture on the planet that has gold that doesn't value it as something that represents power and wealth. An interesting question that I don't think we know the answer to is whether having gold conferred power on the person who possessed it, or whether it was the individuals who possessed it that made gold a valuable material. I suspect it was a little bit of both. What I think is most interesting about these gold objects is that they acquired stories of their own through the way that they were used. Those are stories that we can recover very easily, but we can certainly use our imaginations and realize that these are objects that would have been recognized as belonging to specific individuals, much like the crown jewels of England.
Sometimes we can reconstruct a part of the past from fragments. We can draw inspiration from an object's form, design, and craftsmanship. Or from what is known, we can make a plausible guess about the people who made it. At other times, we have only the enduring brilliance of gold. It is the most lasting evidence we have of what the Cochlear people of ancient Panama found valuable, sacred, and beautiful.